Once upon a time, in the hills of Ephraim, there lived a woman named Hannah. She was the beloved wife of Elkanah, a man of kindness and wealth, a man who gave her everything, except the one thing she longed for most: a child. Hannah was barren, and though she tried to hide her pain, it followed her like a shadow. It was there in the mornings when she awoke to the sound of children's laughter in the courtyard. It was there in the evenings when she sat beside Elkanah at the feast, his hand warm over hers, his love not quite enough to erase the emptiness in her heart. But worst of all, it was there in Peninnah, Elkanah's second wife. The woman who had given him sons and daughters, who had filled their home with the one thing Hannah could not. Peninnah, who looked at Hannah with a smirk that cut like a blade, who never missed an opportunity to remind her that she was less. Peninnah, whose children clung to Elkanah's robes as they ran to him, calling him father, a word Hannah had never heard from her own lips. And yet, in the silence of her suffering, in the ache that wrapped itself around her heart, there was Elkanah. He loved her. Not out of duty, not because of what she could give him, but because of who she was. "Why do you weep, my love?" he asked her one evening, his fingers gently tilting her chin toward him. "Why do you not eat? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Hannah's breath hitched. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell him that his love was enough. But love could not fill the space only a child could fill, and so she did not answer. She only turned her face away, blinking back the tears she refused to let him see. That year, as the time came for their family to travel to Shiloh for the yearly sacrifice, Hannah made a decision. She would go. But she would not leave as the same woman. She would lay her sorrow before the Lord. She would pray, and she would not rise until he answered her. The journey to Shiloh was long, the road winding through rolling hills, dust rising beneath the hooves of donkeys as the caravan moved forward. Hannah sat beside Elkanah, her hands folded in her lap, her heart heavy with longing. Peninnah rode ahead, her laughter carrying on the wind, her children running beside her. Hannah did not speak. She only watched, listened, and felt the ache in her chest grow sharper with each passing mile. She had come to Shiloh for years. She had stood in the great courts of the tabernacle, watched as the priests lifted offerings, heard the prayers of the people as they bowed before the Lord. And every year she had prayed, and every year she had left empty. But this year had to be different, because she had nothing left to hold on to except her faith. That evening, as the feast began, the scent of roasted lamb and sweet wine filled the air. Servants carried trays of food, laughter echoed through the halls, and Elkanah, ever loving, placed a double portion of food before Hannah. It was his way of showing her love, his way of reminding her that she was still cherished, still his favorite, still enough, but she could not eat. Not tonight. She pushed the plate away, her hands trembling as she rose to her feet. Elkanah reached for her wrist, concern in his eyes. "Hannah?" he murmured. She met his gaze, forcing a small smile. I need to pray." Elkanah hesitated, but he nodded, letting her go. And so, with her heart pounding, Hannah slipped away into the night. The tabernacle was quiet, the golden glow of oil lamps flickering against the stone walls. Hannah fell to her knees, her hands clenching the fabric of her robes, and for the first time in her life, she let herself break before the Lord. Tears spilled freely as she whispered her desperate plea. "Lord of hosts, if you will look upon your servant's misery, if you will remember me and not forget your servant, but give me a son, Then I will give him back to you. All the days of his life, he will be yours." Her lips moved silently, her body shaking, her soul poured out like a sacrifice before the Lord. She did not see the priest watching her from the shadows. Eli, the high priest, narrowed his eyes, stepping forward. "How long will you be drunk?" he asked, his voice harsh in the silence. "Put away your wine." Hannah's head snapped up, her breath catching. Drunk? Did he not see her pain, her desperation? She quickly wiped her tears, shaking her head. "No, my lord," she said, her voice unsteady. "I am not drunk. I have not had wine or strong drink. I am a woman deeply troubled, and I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord." Eli studied her for a long moment. Then his expression softened. "Go in peace," he said, "and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." Hannah stilled, the words settling deep in her heart. Could it be? Could this be the moment she had been waiting for? She rose to her feet, her breath steady for the first time in years. She did not have a child yet. But she had been heard, and sometimes that was enough. The journey home from Shiloh felt different. For years, Hannah had traveled this same road with a heavy heart, carrying the burden of an unanswered prayer. But this time, something had changed. She did not know how, she did not know when, but she felt it, deep in her soul, like the first warmth of the sun after a long night. She had prayed, and the Lord had heard her. Elkanah watched her from across the cart, his brow furrowed in curiosity. "You seem different," he finally said. Hannah turned toward him, smiling softly. "I am." Elkanah chuckled, reaching for her hand. "Did the Lord speak to you?" Hannah did not know how to explain it. She had not heard a voice from heaven. She had not received a sign in the stars, but there was peace in her heart, and that was more than she had ever had before. "I believe he has," she whispered. Elkanah squeezed her hand, a knowing glint in his eyes. "If the Lord has spoken," he said gently, "then we will trust him." Weeks passed, then months, and then the first sign. A wave of nausea in the early morning, a strange, unexplained tiredness, a feeling deep inside her that something was different. She said nothing at first, too afraid to hope. But when the signs became too strong to ignore, when the truth became undeniable, she finally turned to Elkanah one evening, her hand trembling as she took his. She placed it gently over her stomach and whispered the words she had waited her whole life to say. "I am with child." Elkanah stilled, his breath catching, his fingers pressing against her belly as if to confirm the impossible. "A child," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Hannah nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "The Lord remembered me," she whispered. "He has given us a son." Elkanah let out a shaky laugh, pulling her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "You prayed," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "and he answered you." Hannah closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Yes, the Lord had answered, and she would never forget his faithfulness. As the months passed, Hannah's belly grew round with the promise of life, her heart swelling with a joy she had never known before. She whispered prayers over her unborn child, ran her hands over her stomach as she imagined his tiny fingers, his first cry, the day she would hold him in her arms. And when the night came, when pain tore through her body, when the midwives whispered encouragement, when the world narrowed to the sound of her own breathing, she fought, she labored, and then a cry pierced the air. A sound so small, yet it shattered every sorrow she had ever known. The midwife placed him in her arms, and as Hannah looked down at his perfect face, her tears fell freely. Her son, her answered prayer, her greatest joy. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, her lips trembling as she whispered his name for the first time. Samuel, because I asked the Lord for him. And in that moment, as she held him close, she knew God had never forgotten her. Hannah's days were filled with laughter, warmth, and joy unlike any she had ever known. Samuel was everything she had prayed for. She marveled at his tiny fingers as they curled around hers, at his bright eyes as they searched the world with curiosity and wonder. She sang to him in the early mornings, whispering prayers over him, pressing gentle kisses to his forehead. And when he giggled, when he reached for her, when he clung to her robes as he learned to walk, she felt her heart melt with love. This was what she had longed for, what she had wept for, what she had promised to give back. And that thought, that promise, stayed with her. Because she knew one day she would have to let him go. Elkanah noticed the shift in her. She held Samuel a little tighter at night, lingered in the doorway whenever he played, traced his tiny face as if trying to memorize every feature. She was counting the days. Because soon, too soon, the time would come. One evening, as Samuel slept between them, Elkanah reached for her hand. You do not have to do this, he said softly. Hannah turned to him, searching his face. You mean my vow? Elkanah nodded, his expression unreadable. The Lord has blessed you, he murmured. You have given him your heart. Perhaps he will not ask for more. Hannah swallowed hard, her heart warring with itself. Part of her wanted to believe that was true, that God would not require her to give away this child she had prayed so desperately for, but she had made a promise, and God had kept his word. How could she not keep hers? She reached up, brushing her fingers gently over Samuel's curls. I must do this, she whispered. I must give him back, because he was never mine to keep. Elkanah exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around hers. You are the strongest woman I have ever known, he said. Hannah let out a small, shaky laugh. I am simply a mother who trusts the Lord. The years passed quickly, too quickly. Samuel grew strong and bright, his laughter filling their home, his tiny hands learning the ways of the world. And before Hannah was ready, before she could even accept that the moment had come, it was time. The time to take him to Shiloh. The time to give him to the Lord. The night before their journey, Hannah sat beside Samuel's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, feeling the ache of goodbye settle deep into her bones. How did a mother let go of her child? How did she walk away, knowing she would not be there to tuck him in at night, to wipe away his tears, to see him grow into the man he was meant to be? She reached for his hand, holding it gently in hers. Samuel, she whispered. He stirred, his small eyes blinking open sleepily. Mama? Hannah smiled, swallowing the lump in her throat. Tomorrow we go to the house of the Lord, she said softly. Samuel blinked. Will I stay there? Hannah hesitated. Yes, my love, she whispered, because you belong to him. Samuel was silent for a moment, his small fingers gripping hers. Will you come back for me? Hannah felt her heart crack in two. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to his forehead. I will visit you, she promised, and I will always love you. Samuel smiled, satisfied with her answer. And as he drifted back to sleep, Hannah finally let the tears fall. Because tomorrow she would walk away. And it would be the hardest thing she had ever done. The morning came too soon. Hannah awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, the soft light of dawn creeping into the room. But today was not like any other morning. Today she would take Samuel to Shiloh. Today she would leave her son in the house of the Lord. Today she would keep her promise, no matter how much it hurt. She dressed Samuel in his finest tunic, smoothing the fabric with trembling hands. Are we leaving now, Mama? Samuel asked, his voice full of excitement, not fear. Hannah forced a smile. Yes, my love. Today we go to the Lord's house. Samuel grinned, clapping his hands together. I will see the priest. Hannah swallowed hard. Yes, she whispered, you will see Eli. She did not tell him that he would stay with Eli. She did not tell him that this was the last time he would walk beside her in their home, that she would no longer be the one to rock him to sleep or hold his hand when he was afraid. Because he was too young to understand. But she understood. And so she held his hand a little tighter as they set out on the journey. The road to Shiloh was long, dust rising beneath their feet as they traveled through valleys and over hills. Elkanah walked beside them, his quiet strength grounding Hannah as she held Samuel's small hand in hers. As the tabernacle came into view, Hannah felt her chest tighten. This was it. This was the moment she had feared, the moment she had prayed for and dreaded all at once. She had carried Samuel in her womb, held him in her arms, whispered prayers over his tiny body in the middle of the night. And now, she would give him away. Because he was never hers to keep. Eli the high priest stood at the entrance of the tabernacle, his aged eyes full of quiet understanding. Hannah knelt before him, her hands resting on Samuel's shoulders as she spoke. My lord, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I am the woman who once stood here, praying for this child. The Lord has given me what I asked for. She looked down at Samuel, brushing his curls away from his forehead, memorizing every detail of his face. So now, she continued, I give him to the Lord. For his whole life, he will belong to God. Eli nodded solemnly. Hannah turned to Samuel, her heart pounding. Samuel, my love, she whispered, this is your home now. Samuel blinked up at her, his innocent eyes searching hers. You're leaving? He asked softly. Hannah felt something shatter inside her chest. She smoothed a hand over his hair, blinking back the tears threatening to spill. I will visit you, she promised, and I will always love you. Samuel was silent for a moment, his small fingers gripping hers. Then, with the faith of a child, he nodded because he trusted her, and more importantly, he trusted the Lord. Hannah turned, her steps slow and heavy, each one feeling like a wound she could not see. She had given her son to the Lord. She had kept her vow, and now she would walk away. And it would be the hardest thing she had ever done. But even as her arms felt empty, her heart whispered something that made the pain bearable. He was never mine to keep, The journey away from Shiloh felt far longer than the journey there, though the path was the same, winding through the familiar hills and valleys, the dust rising beneath their feet. Hannah walked with slow, measured steps, her heart feeling like it had been left behind in the sacred halls of the tabernacle, resting beside the son she had given away. Her arms, once so accustomed to carrying the weight of Samuel's small body, now hung empty at her sides, and yet she did not cry as she walked away. Not because she did not feel the sorrow pressing down on her, but because she had made peace with it. She had made peace with the knowledge that Samuel was not truly lost to her, that he had not been taken from her in cruelty or misfortune, but rather he had been entrusted into the hands of the one who had given him life in the first place. And yet, even as she reminded herself of this truth, even as she repeated it over and over like a prayer in her mind, it did not take away the ache, the undeniable emptiness that now settled in the deepest part of her soul. She had spent years longing, praying, begging for a child, and for such a short time she had held the answer to that prayer in her arms, had known the depth of a mother's love, had whispered lullabies into his soft curls, and watched his tiny fingers grasp onto hers in absolute trust. And now, in what felt like the cruelest twist of fate, she had willingly laid him on the altar of faith, surrendering the one thing she had prayed for the most. What kind of woman does that? What kind of mother hands over her child to be raised in the presence of an aging priest, to grow up in the service of the temple, far from the warmth of home, far from the safety of her embrace? But Hannah already knew the answer. A woman who trusted God more than she trusted her own heart. A mother who understood that her love, though deep and immeasurable, was still not greater than the love the Lord had for her son. And so, she did not cry. She did not beg for Samuel back. She only walked forward step by step through the dust of the road, carrying her pain not as a burden, but as an offering. Because this was her act of worship, and somehow, in the deepest places of her soul, she knew that it was enough. Elkanah walked beside her in silence, casting glances in her direction every so often, as if waiting for her to crumble, to weep, to break under the weight of the sacrifice she had just made. But she did not break. She could not. Because if she let herself weep, if she let herself truly feel the depth of her sorrow, she feared it would consume her completely and she would never be able to breathe again. So instead, she whispered silent prayers beneath her breath, over and over, until they became the very rhythm of her heartbeat. Lord, fill the emptiness. Let me not regret my sacrifice. Let me see the beauty in what I have given to you. And though the ache in her chest did not vanish, though the absence of Samuel's warm body against hers still made her arms feel painfully hollow, she felt something else stir in its place. Not immediate joy, not relief, but peace. A peace that whispered to her that God was not finished with her story. That this sacrifice, this act of surrender, was not the end, but the beginning of something greater than she could yet understand. Days passed, then weeks, then months. And though life moved forward, though the routines of daily living continued as they always had, Hannah never stopped missing him. She would wake in the quiet moments of the early morning, instinctively reaching to where Samuel had once slept beside her, only to be met with nothing but the empty space where he used to be. She would catch herself humming lullabies as she prepared food, only to fall silent when she remembered that there were no small feet running to hear them anymore. She would kneel in the evening, pressing her hands to the earth as she whispered her prayers, and though she did not ask God to return her son to her, she asked for something else. for him to watch over Samuel in her absence, for him to be the hands that wiped away his tears when she could not be there, for him to be the voice that comforted him in the dark, the presence that held him when he was afraid, the love that filled every space that she had left behind. And little by little, as the months stretched into years, her sorrow did not consume her. It remained because love does not vanish simply because it is given away. But it did not destroy her, because something else had taken root in its place, something deeper, something stronger, a joy that was not dependent on what she could hold, but on who God was, a trust that was not built on what she could see, but on what she knew to be true. And then one day, without warning, everything changed again. It began with a whisper in the stillness of the morning, a subtle shift that Hannah might have missed if she had not been listening. She had been tending to the fire, lost in thought when she felt it. A small, familiar stirring within her body. A sensation she had not expected to feel again. Her heart pounded as she pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, daring to hope, daring to believe that this was not just a trick of her imagination. The days passed, and the signs grew stronger. The same sickness in the early mornings, the same tiredness in the afternoons, the same gentle shift in her body. And then, with tears brimming in her eyes, she turned to Elkanah one evening and whispered the words that once felt impossible. "I am with child again." His eyes widened in shock before a slow, awed smile spread across his face. He placed his hands gently over hers, pressing his palm against her stomach as if to confirm the impossible. "The Lord has blessed you again," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Hannah let out a shaky laugh, pressing a hand to her mouth as the tears finally spilled over. "The Lord has not forgotten me," she whispered. And in that moment, as she felt the stirring of new life growing within her, she knew. Her story was not over. The Lord had seen her sacrifice, and he had answered with abundance. She had given him one child, and now he was giving her more. And in that moment, she understood something she had never understood before. That when we give to God with open hands, when we surrender the things we hold most dear, when we trust him enough to release what we once thought we could never live without, he does not leave us empty. He fills us again and again and again. And now, as she pressed her hand against the life growing inside of her, she smiled through her tears. Because the Lord had given again, because he is always faithful. And because this was not the end, this was just the beginning. Time passed, but Hannah was no longer the woman who wept in silence. She was no longer the woman who walked with an empty heart, whose arms felt like they would never know the warmth of a child again. She had given up her son in faith, believing that the Lord would sustain her in her sacrifice. And now she stood with a hand over her growing belly, carrying yet another blessing from the one who had seen her, heard her, and remembered her. She had thought when she left Samuel at the tabernacle that she would never bear another child, that she had been given one single miracle and was asked to surrender him as a final act of trust. But here she was, standing in the golden light of another sunrise, her heart swelling with the undeniable proof that God does not take without giving back in greater measure. What she had surrendered in faith, God had returned in abundance. Yet even as her heart rejoiced over the new life within her, even as she felt the weight of this new promise from God pressing against her ribs, she never forgot the child she had already given away. She still thought of Samuel every day, still whispered his name in her prayers, still woke in the night sometimes, reaching out in the darkness, only to remember that he was far from her, growing up in the house of the Lord. And yet, there was no sorrow in it now. Because she had trusted God with Samuel, and she knew that he was not alone. He was learning to walk in the ways of the Lord, learning to hear his voice, learning to be the man that God had destined him to be. And as a mother, what more could she ask for? She had spent so many years believing she had been forgotten, that she had been unseen, unheard, as if her prayers had vanished into the void, never to be answered. But now, she understood. God had seen her. God had heard her. And though he had made her wait, though he had allowed her heart to ache, it had never been in vain. The waiting had not been punishment. The pain had not been cruelty. It had been preparation. Because now, she was not just a mother who had longed for a child. She was a mother who had trusted the Lord with everything she had, and she had seen his faithfulness not once, but twice, and now again and again in ways she never could have imagined. The seasons changed again, and soon the time came to return to Shiloh, to once again bring their offerings before the Lord. But this time, Hannah did not travel with an empty heart. This time, she carried both the memory of the son she had given and the life of the child she had yet to meet. As they approached the tabernacle, her heart pounded in anticipation. Would Samuel remember her? Would he recognize her face, or had he grown so accustomed to life in the temple that she was now nothing more than a distant memory, a name spoken in passing? She did not know. And yet, she had faith. She stepped forward, clutching a beautifully woven robe in her hands, made with careful stitches, each thread placed with the love and prayers of a mother who had not forgotten her son. This was the moment she had waited for. She could see him, standing near Eli, his small form growing stronger, his presence confident. She had left him a child, but now he was growing into something more. The moment their eyes met, her breath caught in her throat. Because Samuel did not hesitate. He did not pause, did not shrink away, did not look upon her with confusion. Instead, he smiled. And in that single moment, every fear she had ever carried dissolved like mist in the morning light. He remembered her. He loved her. And as he ran toward her, as she knelt down to embrace him, she realized that the Lord had given her more than just a son. He had given her a legacy. She placed the robe around his shoulders, smoothing the fabric, her fingers lingering on his small hands. "Have you been well, my son?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Samuel nodded, his eyes shining with something that made her heart swell with pride. "The Lord speaks to me," he said softly. Her breath hitched, her heart stilled, and she knew this was why she had given him away. This was why she had surrendered him. Because Samuel was meant for something greater than what she could give him. He was being raised not just as a child, not just as a servant of the tabernacle, but as a prophet, a leader, a man who would change the very course of Israel's history. And Hannah had been chosen to be his mother. What greater honor could there be? The years continued to pass, and with each visit, she saw him grow, saw him flourish in the presence of the Lord. She still missed him. She still longed for the moments she could have had, for the nights she could have tucked him into bed, for the mornings she could have watched him run through the fields. But there was no bitterness in her sacrifice, only joy, only gratitude. Because she had given her child to the Lord, and the Lord had done far greater things with him than she ever could have on her own. And in return, the Lord had given her even more than she had asked for. She bore more children. Her home was filled with laughter and love. Her heart was never empty again. But Samuel would always be her first miracle, her proof that God hears, even when it seems like He is silent. Her testimony that God sees every tear, every whispered prayer, every moment of faith that is too small for the world to notice, but not too small for Him. And as Hannah grew older, as she watched the fruit of her faith unfold, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had been heard. She had been remembered. She had never, not even for a moment, been alone. This was not a story of sorrow. This was not a story of loss. This was a story of faith, of love, of surrender, and of a God who gives more than we can ever imagine when we trust Him with everything we have. This was the story of Hannah, a woman who gave God her greatest longing and received in return more than she ever dreamed possible.